Hi there, and thanks for joining us for this webinar on Are You Teaching or Schooling? Shifting NGSS Instruction to the Way Children Learn. My name is Francis Vigent, and I'm a CEO here at KnowAtom. I'm also a former teacher, and a lot of the ideas we'll be talking about today are ideas if you were an attendee at the Teach conference that you would have encountered as part of Dr. Elmore's discussion of the future of teaching and the present realities of schooling. So with that said, I'd like to just throw out our agenda today for you. And that here is basically the trek we're going to do. So take a look at some definitions. What's the difference between schooling and teaching? And what are some of the ways that we've traditionally looked at this? And how are those ideas changing? Why facts out of context stifle learning from a neurological standpoint? Third, how the new next generation science standards changed the value of a task for teaching. So when we look at a task, and this also comes out of Dr. Elmore's research, one of his major things he likes to talk about is task predicts performance. So the question is if task predicts performance, what is it? What is the value of the task? And what is valuable performance? And that has been really redefined under these new science standards. And finally, what changes are necessary to curriculum and instruction to enable a next generation science learning environment? If you're here on the live session, I'm also going to try to save a little bit of time or hang around for a few minutes at the end to take some live question and answer. So without further ado, the question is, what is school? So let's start there. What is school? And one of the ways I like to sort of think about this is visually in the way that even our society through things like photo stock render school. So if you were to see this picture, you might say, oh, that looks like school, but why? So if you look at the picture, why is it that we would think this is school? Is it because there's many children and only one adult? Is it because they're in a room full of books? Is it because they are all sort of attentive, organized, and reading together? Here's another one. All these children raising their hands at desks, sort of in line, look like they are well behaved. They look like they are attentive. They look like they're following instructions. And there's things around the room that might cue their attention. And finally, you might see a picture like this. So again, could this be school? What is school? You have a bunch of children lined up using computers. They look happy. They look engaged. Is this school? And what's interesting is that when you look to things like photo stock and you type in the word school, these are the types of images that come up. So why is that? And one of the things that's sort of subliminal but is a part of each one of these pictures is really an institution. Okay, so you have to think about school as an institution and what is it doing? One of the things that's a reality is that schools are institutions, some would say for learning, others might say for conformity. Okay, so what's sort of an institution for conformity? Well, just in the word school, school is a grouping. Okay, so we think of a school of fish, similar fish swimming the same direction, going to the same destination, and so on and so forth. So they kind of conform to certain norms. Okay, so if we flip back to these pictures, there are norms here, right? The children are all engaged. They're lined up. They are doing what they're supposed to, okay? They're waiting their turn. They are all following what the teacher is modeling, okay? And that is the institution of school, which doesn't really have anything to do with learning itself, except that how we structure that institution may promote or may not promote learning. And one of the ways that we use this word institution could be higher learning, places like colleges and universities. We think about institutionalized learning as being sort of more of a lecture model a lot of times, or even in things like psychiatric hospitals, institutions for reform. Okay, so a lot of these have been done away with, but there was a point in time in U.S. history where people, they would use this term being institutionalized, where basically people who had behaviors or so on and so forth that didn't conform to societal norms, they would be brought to make them conform. Okay, so we have to be careful about school and what we allow it to become. Is school about an institution, about conformity, or is it about something else? So thinking about institutions just from a definition standpoint, an institution has sort of one of three definitions here. A society or organization founded for a purpose, could be religious, educational, social, or so on. An established law, practice, or custom. Okay, so if you think about schools as institutions of learning, they have very, unfortunately, sometimes rigid practices and customs. Or are they places that are, the actual action of instituting something, enacting it? Okay, and so the first thing I would ask you to consider when you think about schooling is, what is the purpose? Okay, what is the purpose of the school? Or what is the purpose of the institution that you serve? Okay, and then what I would say is, what is the something that your school or that we are trying to institute? Okay, because my suggestion to you here today would be that these two things have sort of gotten lost and a bit shifted over time, and that basically we've gone from schools that the focus or the purpose was learning in a lot of cases, to where we now view school as a place where we enact curriculum and standards. Okay. We can learn, and this is what we're going to get into around the next generation science standards, is we can learn skills, but the idea of enacting curriculum, or the idea of enacting standards in and of itself is an institution. It is something that's kind of being foisted upon others, and you can't foist a skill. It doesn't happen. Okay, and the problem that we're facing sometimes when schooling and teaching get confused, because again, are we teaching or schooling? A lot of the confusion comes around this, that if you, and this is what I think of when I think of the confusion. Imagine the grocery store where you see, folks putting things on shelves and they go up and down those rows, and what do? They sort goods, they put them in their place, and they spin them around so they all face the same direction. And unfortunately, the institution of school, this idea of enacting standards and curriculum, this sort of more social control model, transfer of knowledge that school has become, unfortunately has created a subgroup of schools and of educators who believe that it's their job to sort and straighten. Okay, as if the kids were products on the shelf that could end up in the wrong location, that are oriented the wrong way, and that as a result of good teaching, they all are spun around in the right place and are conforming to the expectations, of school and of society. And I don't want to get, when I say words like society, I don't want to sound like I'm, out in left field and super abstract. The problem here is that the classroom environment, curriculum, pedagogy, especially once children get into middle school, is oftentimes centered on what children should be doing, how they should be acting, what they should be remembering, and proficiency and mastery as being sort of this concept of being in the right place at the right time when you are called upon, okay? And so I'd like to suggest that teaching is something that's much different. Teaching is about creating an environment for learning, an environment that forces students to think. I really love this quote from David Perkins in Smart Schools. It's, learning is a consequence of thinking. Okay, so what is learning? Learning is a consequence of thinking. Why do we think? We think to deepen our understanding, okay? To develop and deepen an understanding of the world around us. So engaging in that process is learning, okay? It changes. Learning is a process where what we believe or what we think or what we know is modified. It changes, okay? So you might think of this in sort of a reflection process, right? We could reflect on things like why plants die in one area of the schoolyard and not in another, okay? We could come up with a series of ideas about why that's happening. We may have some evidence to support those ideas, but the learning comes when we engage in testing our hypotheses about why that phenomena is happening. And as a result of engaging in that testing, we gather data that allows us to reflect on those ideas that we had about why this is happening and then rearrange it. Okay, so we rearrange our understanding. And by doing so, our understanding becomes deeper, more nuanced, more complete, and more evidence-based. Okay, so the role of the teacher is to create an environment for that, okay, in the classroom. So, you know, not an environment where children are getting spun around in the right, you know, put into their place, spun around the right way and corrected by an adult, as much as an environment that requires students to think in order to progress and participate, okay? And an environment where there is value to doing that. So more granular, when we talk about thinking, okay, what actually is thinking? I like to think about the 8 thinking moves, Ron Ritchhart's 8 thinking moves from making thinking visible. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. When we ask students to think about things, or we expect them to be thinking, they should be engaged in some combination of the following 8 things, if not more, okay? First being observing closely and describing what's there. Building explanations and interpretations of what's happening. Reasoning about why that's happening with some evidence. Okay, where are these things coming from? Observation, okay, interpretation. So you see they become interrelated very quickly. Making connections between what's happening, between what we've seen elsewhere, between what we've learned previously, or what we may believe. Considering different viewpoints and perspectives, okay? Taking on another person's or potential alternate idea and evidence that they're presenting. Capturing the heart and forming conclusions, really being able to step back and look at something as a system and not just up close as a singular part, okay? To form conclusions and wonder and ask questions. The role of this is, again, to wonder and ask questions is that risk-taking that further deepens understanding, right? It provides a basis for experimentation, for evidence gathering and reasoning. And then, kind of finally here, uncovering the complexity and going below the surface. So again, looking at circumstances as not entirely single, you know, one-dimensional, not being something that you know, we can expect that all things are what they seem to be. Okay, that at first glance we are not necessarily going to understand entirely what's happening, and to do so may lead us to false conclusions. Okay, so that's a big part. These 8 things are a big part of thinking. So in a next generation learning environment, we would ask the question is, what is that? I said making an environment for learning is the role of the teacher here, right? Engaging students in thinking, where there's not really a way to progress through class without thinking. So a next generation learning environment is an environment for creativity, analysis, and decision making. And it's a place where students develop control and agency. Okay. And how do they do that? They do it by engaging science and engineering practices with consequences. And this is some definitions modified from Dr. Ritchhart Elmore, but and he's a research professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Again, the Teach Conference this year, he was a keynote speaker. But the next generation learning environment, I want to unpack this for a second. So creativity, analysis, and decision making on behalf of the student, okay, without the intervention or without the direct prompting of an adult, okay? It's an environment where these things can happen independently and asymmetrically, okay? Among individual students, among small teams of students, and a place where students can develop control and agency. I want to make sure you don't overlook that what this means is it's a place where students experience a release of responsibility, where they learn to develop control over their thinking, their judgment, the amount of risk that they're willing to engage in. And agency, what we mean by that is that agency is seeing a purpose and value to engaging in the world around them, okay? Because that classroom is the world around them. So many activities that we see students engaging in classrooms that aren't using KnowAtom, and sometimes, unfortunately, traditional educators who receive KnowAtom try to take it and apply it in a traditional sense. They're applying it in a traditional sense when they remove student agency and their opportunity to develop control. So what that means is a student in a classroom bringing their ideas to life, the idea of their team or their individual self, learning that they can control and manipulate the variables in an experiment in order to gather relevant data to try to understand whether a hypothesis or a prototype solves a problem or answers a question. And thereby doing it, they understand that they can better uncover the complexities and understand phenomena and things like this by executing their agency to actually investigate, okay, to use the results of investigation to support argumentation. Okay, so that's where these science and engineering practices come to life. I want to highlight the word consequences here. Consequences doesn't mean, like in my parents' generation, like the spanking that comes with, doing what you're not supposed to do. That's not the consequence. It's not failing. It's not getting the F or the D or this sort of thing. That's not the kind of consequence we're talking about. What we're talking about here is taking intellectual risks that, as a result of that risk, I end up in a circumstance that requires me to execute my judgment, to attempt to engage certain science and engineering practices. And the result of that is something I wholly own, okay? That success is not a 1 or a 0, but it's actually a gradient, okay? It's not black and white, it's a gradient. And so what happens is that through the inquiry process, a student is not going to be perfectly successful, and they're most likely not going to be a total failure. They're going to encounter mistakes. They're going to encounter situations where they lacked knowledge, they lacked judgment, they lacked foresight. And so the results that they see in front of them are exactly the product of their thinking. And so what that does is that consequence helps students to refine their practices their understanding and understand areas that they need to control and where they can execute agency more differently. Okay, so this is really important. And I would say that a next generation learning environment looks much more like this than it does like those pictures I showed you at the very beginning of classrooms that came up with photo stock. Here's why. This is an environment where children can develop control. They can develop agency. And in fact, they are engaging in this environment with consequences. Okay, so an example of that is, if I run around this playground and I fail to control my urge to do that, one consequence is I may fall and skin my knee. Okay, so falling and skinning my knee is sort of a mistake. It's an error of judgment. It's a place where I lack control. And as a result, I experience the consequence of skinning my knee, which is something I don't like. It's uncomfortable. But you know what? I have control over this situation, and I can intervene and prevent that from happening in my environment by not running around the playground. And the same goes for jumping off things, for cooperating with other children, the way that we play our game or the way that we swing a swing into somebody else's face. I mean, there's some natural consequences to doing this, which are unpleasant or so on, but there's children are learning constantly, not just in school. So it's important to think of our classroom as an opportunity for children to engage in a way that results in something that is suboptimal. And then that, as a result of suboptimal, it's an opportunity for a child to reflect. And the environment we create should require reflection, right? Like if we reflect on the fact that we were running around, which is why, we tripped and fell on the playground, that's a learning opportunity. Okay, the framework of running was not helpful, but walking or jogging or fast walking is something more appropriate. And this is the way that it works. In the classroom, instead of dealing with swings and slides, we may be dealing with concepts. Okay, so the concept of transfer of energy or force and motion. Okay, the concept of how different chemicals come together, whether they're exothermic or endothermic, and how we engage those concepts in relation to each other has outcomes. Okay, and we're able to gather data around those outcomes. So when we gather that data, and this is whether it's a kindergarten, a first grade level, or an 8th grade level, or a 12th grade level, it gives us an opportunity to reflect back on, one, what has happened in this literal sense, why it happened, and what that means in a more general sense for when we encounter this type of situation or problem or question in the future. Okay, so we could look at 1,000 playgrounds. The idea of not running sort of uncontrollably and watching where we're going while we're running, that concept and its value in this context is also valuable in a lot of other contexts as well. Okay, so how do students learn? So the actual neuroscience of it is something that Dr. Elmore did a really wonderful job of this during our Teach conference. Basically, what you have is the limbic system, which is this center system here, the innermost kind of parts of the brain, working with the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobe up here in the front of the brain, which is sort of the more, from an evolutionary perspective, is the newer part of the brain. And what I want to do is just sort of highlight for you here that you've got one thing called the hippocampus, which is dealing with spatial memory. Okay, it stores facts in context. And one of the things the quotes I really love from Dr. Elmore is, there's no such thing as a fact to the brain. The brain processes context. So what happens here is that this part of the brain, sorry, right here in red, it is processing the context of sort of the space around us, okay? And so it's taking in the facts, but it's doing so anchored in the space around us. Well, next to that, we have the amygdala, which is this green piece here. And what that does is that is responsible for all of the risk and reward chemicals and functioning of the brain. And again, this is a very old and sort of primitive part of the brain, just like the hippocampus. And what it does is it uses emotion to define a stimulus, okay? And what it does is it writes a memory the way that we perceive it emotionally, okay? So what you've got here, you can imagine a context, okay? And I'll give you a little example. So, okay, so a context. So eating a bagel with cream cheese, okay? So the bagel, the space, the cream cheese, and all of that, sort of the facts of the color and the smell and whatever is sort of stored in my mind. But let's say that cream cheese has gone bad, okay? So the emotion that I get is very negative. You know, it's like, oh, this is disgusting. And, you know, I get sort of stress hormones or whatever related to it, and I spit it out, okay? So the resulting sort of memory of all of this may be that, you know, bagels are gross, they taste bad, and I don't like them, okay? So it's kind of a very primitive sort of animalistic way of our brain works. What's interesting is that we have this other part of the brain up here. So I guess maybe before we go any further, you can imagine being in a middle school classroom where somebody is trying to say the condensation is when, you know, water goes from a gas to a liquid, okay, or condenses to form droplets. If a student has no context for that, okay, if their emotion towards the very environment where this sort of training exercise of, you know, what's the definition, match it to the word, what's this a picture of, match it to the word, you know, so on and so forth. If that is the method of instruction, all you're doing is you are fighting the way the brain actually works, okay? The brain is looking for a context, and if it's, you know, it's going to evaluate that context emotionally. And so by just presenting a fact, so what, okay? What happens here, so it's, you know, another fact from research is that the mainstream research says that 70 to 75% of classroom interactions between students and teachers are memory-based tasks. And when you ask teachers, oftentimes they will look at those memory-based tasks and say that, you know, they require higher order thinking or these sort of things. But in reality, Dr. Elmore says that that's, you know, those sort of reflections, it's aspirational. It's like an aspirational reflection on a memory task. And so those memory tasks are basically trying to push a fact into a space that only deals with context, not facts in isolation. And it's trying to force recall when basically our attitudes about these facts color whether or not we really are able to retrieve them. Because what's happening is that fact is anchored in sort of a context, and that creates this network that's important for recalling. So it's a very inefficient way of teaching. So it's no wonder that as the model of instruction, when you go from an elementary level to a middle school level and to high school and so on, goes from one of more experiential, hands-on, contextual learning at an early elementary level to something that's more sort of didactic and sometimes draconian with sort of training drills in middle school and high school a lot of times. The children lose interest in science, but they also, when you look at standardized test scores, they drop. A student's performance level drops. okay? Now, particularly at the middle school level. Now, I want to talk about this other piece of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. So what this is responsible for is conscious contextual analysis, focus, creativity, decision making. This is the part of the brain that you go into a meeting with somebody you don't like, and you remember the context and emotions of why you don't like them and how you don't like them. But this piece of the brain intervenes to manipulate that context to give you social control and to help you engage in creatively processing who's in front of you and what's unfolding, so that you can come to a beneficial outcome and learn from it. Okay, and what's interesting is this part of the brain interacts with these part of the brain, these two parts of the brain, in order to engage in creativity. Okay, so that's how students learn. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you here is that this traditional model of instruction, where content flows through a teacher and the teacher explains and judges students by their ability to re-explain, flies in the face of giving students a context to process, but it also leaves them devoid of an opportunity to create, to evaluate, to analyze. And so it's not engaging any of these executive functioning skills, because this is the center of executive function. So the result of this gives us students who are dependent. Okay, they are dependent on the teacher to tell or explain, and it's not developing that student's executive function. It's not developing their agency. It's not developing their control. It's actually quite the opposite. It removes agency, makes students dependent. Okay, now the traditional concept of schooling basically has these three definitions, which Dr. Elmore points out. Schooling is about social control and the allocation of status. If we think back to the original schools, sort of back to sort of early industrialization, it's how to behave and participate in the factory, okay, and to allocate grades to students so that the jobs and the path that they take in life suits who they are, sort of in this fixed mindset sort of sense. The A kids or the honors kids from the non-honors track kids and so on. Learning in a traditional model is about the accumulation of information, formulas, that sort of thing, and it determines the merit of students and their abilities. Okay, so that's the A, the B, the C, the valedictorian versus something else. The next generation model, okay, where these new standards are going, are much more in line with how students' brains work, how students learn, and also what's valuable for participation in the discipline of science and engineering, which is problem solving and answering questions using evidence. Okay, so the next generation model of instruction is really one where the teacher acts as a coach. Okay, somebody who is controlling an environment, not an individual. Okay, controlling the learning environment and the level of challenge, and helping to engage students in thinking and risk taking, but not doing the thinking and the risk taking for the student, not taking away the challenge, not removing the opportunity for mistakes. Okay, not creating homogeneous grouping or homogeneous thinking. Okay, in this case, the teachers are valued for their ability to maintain rigor across three dimensions, not their ability to explain something to a student. They're also valued for their ability to question and challenge students' thinking and their skills. The role of the student in this environment is to engage the content, to develop and use it, okay, with their thinking, to engage those thinking moves I showed you earlier. And so students are proficient when they're able to independently perform the expectations of the standards. That's why these new science standards are called performance expectations. All right. What this means is students are making sense and developing and using the 3 dimensions in order to solve problems and answer questions for themselves or in small groups. And so when you think about the idea of content, content is disciplinary core ideas and the different ways that those disciplinary core ideas can be combined. Okay, the different lenses with which we can view the disciplinary core ideas, the way that those disciplinary core ideas can manifest themselves. So that's sort of that is the real world around us, okay? The student is developing skills or attempting science and engineering practices, developing those practices as skills in order to develop and use that content. And what's key here is that when the teacher goes away in this scenario, the student remains able to engage the content with those skills. Okay, they have developed an ability, and that is key. All right, that ability, those skills, those science and engineering practices are really a driver, a tool for accessing the content and connecting that content across cross-cutting concepts. Now, the next generation's concept of schooling is very different. And so, again, Dr. Elmore, I'm going to quote him here, it's in contrast to what I showed you earlier. What I showed you earlier were different definitions of these same words, okay? And they're at odds with each other. Schooling, the next generation concept of schooling is organized learning. Well, what's learning? Learning is consciously modifying beliefs, understandings, and actions in the presence of evidence, experience, and reflection. That's what learning is all about. And that's true of science. That's true of English language arts. That's true of math. It's true of everything. Okay? A student who's learning is consciously modifying beliefs, understandings, and actions in the presence of evidence, experience, and reflection. In the context of the next generation science standards, we need to engage students in the classroom in an environment where they can independently, and when I say independently, small groups is fine, whatever, but not as a result of the teachers handing them something to do, but instead as a result of this sort of prompting and nurturing and coaching, okay, around and engaging in unpacking anchor phenomena at the, sort of the get-go, engaging in developing evidence, experience, and reflection, and using that to form a belief and then modify it, or an understanding and modify it, okay, or an action and modify it. And the thing is, when I'm saying or, it really is and or, because learning and next generation science standards and next generation science classrooms are not one-dimensional, okay? They're very dynamic. So the pedagogy and sort of the approach to this has to be very dynamic. So when we think about the assessment here, assessment is not about, back to the 20th century model of school for industrialization. It's not about assigning students an A so that they can go on to a college that will get them a job, that is, quote unquote, matches their capabilities. Instead, what assessment is about, it's about monitoring the development of learning and the effectiveness of teaching, okay? The purpose of formative assessment, and really why these next generation science centers are focused on formative assessment, is that we want to monitor the development of learning so that we can improve our teaching, that our teaching stimulates learning more effectively, but we also want students to walk away from that formative assessment understanding what it means to learn well and to be able to enact that for themselves, okay? And that very process is what leads students to consciously modifying beliefs, understandings, and actions in the presence of evidence, experience, and reflection. It puts students in the driver's seat of their own learning, okay? So what is the symptom, or what are some symptoms of teaching? I think of this. Earlier I showed you that school of fish. They were all swimming the same way, they all looked the same and everything. The reality is that the symptoms of a next generation science class is that you have differing opinions, okay? It's a space that's safe to take risks. It's a space where we struggle productively, okay? And, this is oversimplified. Maybe a more realistic look is something like this, that the diversity of ideas and outcomes is authentic, okay? That it's not about everyone's idea being identical or coming to 100% consensus on something, but instead what we can do is we can develop the skills to understand the differences in consensus, and that we can use disagreement as the foundation for experimentation and for evidence gathering, and use that evidence as the basis for argumentation, okay? So, much more of this sort of environment than this sort of environment even. And the reality is that we are engaging students in the classroom because we always, hear in education about preparing children for the real world. Well, if you think you want to prepare students for the real world, you need to create an authentic learning environment, because the real world they're facing is something like you see here, okay? It's a place where people are not schooling and all swimming in unison in one direction, where there's a particular answer, a particular goal, but in fact where everybody has different goals and different agendas and is facing a different direction. And so the takeaway for students from their K-12 or pre-K-12 experience needs to be tools for navigating a world of problems and questions for themselves. So where are they going to get that experience? Okay. They need the classroom to be a place where they can practice agency and control to solve problems and answer questions. So when you think about, back to the school of fish model, when a predator comes along, does the individual have the skill or the tool to solve the problem or answer the question for themselves? And in the classroom, we don't have predators in the classroom. But the thing is that our job as teachers, as being a skillful coach, is understanding how to break up schooling activity, not by telling children that they're right or wrong and here's the answer, but instead by asking questions that cause a kind of disturbance in what might be, partial thinking. So, I like to think about it in the class, even though, I don't bite my students, but I think of it as, I'm going to prey on concepts, or I'm going to prey on thinking to a degree, because I want to see if that group of students can argue from evidence to sort of maintain the framework that they've developed, or if they refine that framework, or if they develop a new framework as a result of it. So having that ability to perturb the environment's important, but you have to create an environment where that's okay, and where students understand that risk-taking and struggling is not something that you are penalized for, but is something that's encouraged and is part of proper engagement, okay? Now, how has NGSS changed the value of a teaching task? Well, I hope it's becoming a bit more clear here as we're going along, but basically when you look at one of these standards, students who demonstrate understanding can perform the expectation. So in this case, develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. Students who are proficient are able to demonstrate their understanding in context. A student can't develop a model to describe the movement of matter among anything unless there's a context. So that's important. And the thing is that these performance expectations can be tested, multiple performance expectations, by the same question or by the same scenario, okay? So what happens is you get overlap of those three dimensions. This performance expectation is performed in 3 dimensions simultaneously. So it's not just a performance expectation, it's actually a set of skills that are required in order to perform that expectation, those science and engineering practices. There are disciplinary core ideas which need to be sort of called upon, knit together, applied or modified in order to understand the context and develop the model, okay, or communicate thinking in that model. And then the last piece is those cross-cutting concepts, the different lenses or different ways of looking at a particular context, because most likely there are different models that could be a part of this, okay, depending on what aspect of data or what aspect of a scenario we look at. So this, what I've just described to you, is not, you know, my mother's or my grandfather's teaching experience, or even my own, learning experience, or even my own learning experience. A task is no longer about producing a conforming product. Remember, we talked about school as being sort of that environment for conformity, you know, to create conformity. Well, what you see on the left here is exactly that type of a task. I'm the teacher going to demonstrate something, or I'm the ebook going to show you something, or I'm the app that's going to have a simulation that shows you something, which you then go back and repeat or recall or reproduce or do as was shown or was done before you, okay? That's what's happening here. That's the traditional model. Teacher shows student, then student goes and does it for themselves. Good students watch and listen, and good students do what the teacher did, okay? Good students don't have agency. Good students don't have control, all right? Good students don't really suffer the consequences of taking risks. What you see on the right is what happens in our classrooms, in KnowAtom classrooms, where these two students have to wrestle with concepts that they are somewhat unsure about, that relationships that are kind of tentative in terms of how one concept relates to another. And together, what they have to do is they have to exercise control over aspects of what they're creating and what they're thinking. They need to take risks, and they need to calculate how much risk they're willing to take. And they need to capture something out of that productive struggle that helps them to reflect on whether what they think is the answer to the question or what they think is the solution to the problem actually is, okay? And to be able to use evidence that they've gathered to make that argument, whether it is or is not, okay? So this type of teaching task, where students haven't been given a demonstration or shown a model and that sort of thing, the value of the teaching task is its ability to develop the students' thinking skills, their agency, and create a safe environment for them to experience the consequences of their thinking and of their actions, okay? Think of it as intellectual consequences. That happens here. It does not happen here, okay? This is what we need next generation science classrooms to look like. This is what we need to stop emulating and teaching teachers to do, okay? Now, how do we learn? Well, I'm going to come back to that quote, learning is a consequence of thinking. Some people would think or hear about this and be like, yeah, that's nice, but I've got a test. Well, guess what? Back to the way the brain works, okay? All the 70 to 75% of those memory-related tasks, you know, here I show you what to do, now go do it for yourself, remember that. Yeah, there's some context, but you know what? It's boring. You know what? So what? What's the purpose of it? You know, that's creating an emotional response. There's really no purpose here other than pleasing the teacher. So the relationship between the student and the teacher in terms of how much that student wants to please the teacher becomes the driving factor. Over here, the student is invested in a problem or question that they see relevance in because they developed it, okay? They then, through their curiosity, are wondering what the answer to that problem or question is. Could it be what they're thinking? So let's develop a way to find out. Okay, again, my ideas as students. Then what is the actual result of that? Let's use it. Let's engage it hands-on. Let's create that prototype. Okay, I'm developing my agency. I'm developing my skills, my science and engineering practices. I am using the disciplinary core ideas. I'm having to look at different ways of viewing this content and the way it manifests itself. And I am refining all of those three dimensions while I am performing the expectation of the standard, and likely more than one standard. Okay, this is that next generation learning environment. This is the type of task that now has value because it is developing skills and agency in three dimensions. okay? One of the things I want to mention to you here is that, Bloom's taxonomy is kind of a theory, but I really like what, there's a book called Making Thinking Visible. And what they say is that, thinking deepens understanding. Okay, so instead of thinking of Bloom's taxonomy as this sort of regimented, you have to do this in order to reach that and so on in a certain order, what we want to do is think of all of those elements of higher order thinking and even lower order thinking as tools for deepening understanding. Okay, just like the science and engineering practices are tools for engaging in the discipline of actually engaging as a scientist or engaging as an engineer, answering a question or solving a problem from evidence. Okay, how do you do this? I'm often asked, well, you need to create a culture of thinking among students and adults. Okay, so that environment that you're creating as a teacher needs to be one where thinking is at the center. Why is the adult aspect of this important? Well, children grow into the intellectual life of those around them. And I love this quote. School is no longer about the quick right answer, filling in the blank, circling the right letter, but it's about the ongoing mental work of understanding new ideas and information. And I would add to that, refining our existing ideas and the information that we have. And one of the things I didn't mention about our memories is that they are something that are corrupted by the way our brain works and our future memories. This is something that's been known by the criminal justice system for a long time, that an individual's memory, regardless of their intentions or so on, changes over time. Okay, so memory is very unreliable. So in order, developing skills in a network or a framework of understanding makes memory and retrieval something that becomes more reliable, but also something that's more valuable, more long-lasting, and so on. So one of the things that people are facing right now is this issue of, oh, I need to make the switch to new standards. Well, I just want to highlight for you that you can't get from a vision to impact without a few things. One is, what is that programming, whether it's something that you've created yourself, if you use KnowAtom, great. A program is not going to get you from your vision to an impact. You need professional development because a lot of what I've just described may be new to you, okay? It might be new to your team. It may represent a way of teaching and learning that's not commonplace in your current instructional culture, in your school or your district, okay? So that takes professional development. It's hard to operate in a vacuum, and I'll point out how that sort of fleshes itself out. Professional development is responsible for, in a lot of ways, how people approach the classroom, but the performance in the classroom is the result of teaching. Learning is a result of teaching. So if the performance of the students does not give us the impact that we're looking for, we need to look at that performance and how we define success. And we either need to engage in more professional development, more targeted professional development, coaching, implementation, support, and so on. These are all things that we do, with our users. It's really important. These new standards are not the kind of thing where you're like, oh, our vision is to make next generation science standards a part of our curriculum. We need some pieces to put into the curriculum, and then that will have an impact. It doesn't work that way. Okay, there's a lot of different parts to programs. Okay, phenomena, discourse, habits of mind, arguing from evidence, all that sort of stuff. Professional development is all about helping educators build skills and understand what effective instruction is all about under these new standards. Everything from what these NGSS standards are, the 3 dimensions, essentially empowering the educator to create that environment. And performance, from a student's perspective, what does it mean to be a good, quote, good student? How do we learn? What is the expectation of the science classroom? How do I interpret struggle? How do I interpret risk? How do I interpret mistakes? Okay. So one of the things that I'll encourage you, and I'm almost to the end here, looks like I'll go a couple minutes over, and I apologize if you need to jump off. You have to be very careful as you're using rubrics. You need to think before, during, and after you're using rubrics for your own curriculum, for curriculum of others. And what I mean by that is you really need to engage in thinking about the language that's being used, what it means, what it requires, okay? And really taking it back to the root of instruction, the root of the standard. So here's a few from the EQUIP rubric I'll point out to you. Some of the criteria for evaluation of materials. Looking for places where, grade appropriate elements of the science engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts, and this is key, work together to support students in three-dimensional learning, okay? So what does this mean? All three dimensions are happening simultaneously, okay, in such a way that they're supporting students in making sense of the phenomena, or which would be answering questions or solving problems for themselves. So that's basically what we've highlighted here: elements of the practices to make sense of phenomena, elements of the disciplinary core ideas to make sense of phenomena, and so on, okay, and all in the service of making sense of phenomena or designing solutions. So the three dimensions work together, they support the sense making. Another piece I want to point out, providing a need to engage, developing proficiency on a targeted set of performance expectations. These are all specific criteria. Here's what happens, though, when you operate in a vacuum. Okay, the danger of schools and districts operating in a vacuum is, well, what is phenomena? So here's a literal piece of feedback from a phenomena-driven lesson from somebody who didn't really know what they were looking at. And I want to point out to you all of the contradictions that are here. All right. So this is what the person said. Now you'll have to take my word for it, but the lesson in the unit definitely was designed for next generation science standards. The phenomena was there. Drives teaching and learning. This is what the person said. There is no phenomena at all. No anchoring phenomena, no guiding questions. There is not a single phenomena in the unit. So if we continue down, the lesson phenomena, so now we're recognizing that there's phenomena, seem more like traditional approaches to science investigation rather than NGSS idea of phenomena. The unit begins with a sinkhole phenomena. Okay, so we've just gone from saying that there was no phenomena at all, not even a single one, but the unit actually begins with a sinkhole phenomena. And that sinkhole phenomena moves forward to a final project engineering a water filtration device. Now, I'll step back from this for a second. And if you know anything about sinkholes, sinkholes tend to form in limestone. Limestone acts as a water filtration device, sort of a natural water filtration device in nature, okay? What causes sinkholes is reactions between chemicals in the water, the materials in the limestone, basically like the acids and bases, and so that interaction creates a hole in the rock, all right? But let's continue on seeing how this goes. So the initial phenomenon does not seem to anchor the whole unit. But what this person just said was that the unit begins with a sinkhole phenomena and that it moves toward a final project where children are engaged in engineering water filtration devices. And as I just explained to you, water filtration devices mimic what's going on in an actual sinkhole and connects to how that sinkhole forms. But this person didn't see, first of all, that there were any phenomena, but then when they saw it, they didn't understand that connection themselves. And so they actually come to the conclusion that they are not sure an anchoring phenomena or lesson phenomena is here. So what surprises me is that that this type of feedback is generated by teams who operate in a vacuum, and what they don't do is they don't come to an understanding about something like what phenomena is, how it plays a role in the unit or lesson, and how these pieces integrate. So they operate in this sort of confused state, okay? And that's a problem because as a result of this type of feedback, this is what's shaping what will be the future of curriculum and instruction in this school or district. And let's say that that doesn't change for 10 years. So let's continue on. What is three-dimensional learning? Okay, here's a danger of operating it in a vacuum here from a rubric standpoint. Little student choice in the direction the investigation takes. The investigations seem more like traditional scientific method rather than science and engineering practices of the next generation science standards. Much more teacher-driven and coached. The actual words for each of the NGSS components, and this is key, like science, SEPs, science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas are not referred to in the activities or discussion for either what the teacher should say or the student. So here's somebody who, and I want to stop here for a second, is expecting to get a script that includes all of the potential variation around what students could choose, directions they could take in an investigation, okay, because they're coming from that traditional background. The idea of a scientific process looking like a scientific method, this person doesn't understand that scientific and engineering processes are essentially requiring science and engineering practices in different combinations. And so they're viewing any type of process as being something that's teacher-driven and coached. Now, what they mean by coach here, I'm not sure entirely, but that would be, my take on it. But coaching, as I said earlier, is a part of a next generation inquiry environment because we need students authentically engaging in the actual concepts for themselves, okay, across all three dimensions. Now, further thing, and I highlighted in red here, the idea that science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas should be explicitly communicated and sort of required back from teachers and students is sort of again, back to this old school, almost draconian model of standard on the board, where we cover something, a specific standard, a specific element of a science and engineering practice or something, cover it and go on. That's what this person is looking for. But again, that is not, just because something says phenomena, that does not actually mean that phenomena or practice, that a practice has been engaged, okay? The three dimensions come to life by virtue of how you the environment of the classroom, okay? It comes to life as a result of pedagogy. Pedagogy is not something that can be scripted. Pedagogy is a skill. It's a skill in how a learning environment is developed, maintained, and transitioned, okay? So again, back to this poor person being confused. Activities certainly use three dimensions, but are these dimensions explicit, okay? So they go from, again, saying that science and engineering practices really aren't involved here, that it's all teacher-driven, that nothing's, being referred to or so on, coming down to the idea, and also the student having no direction or choice, and then kind of coming to the conclusion that the activities require the three dimensions, but are they explicit, okay? And I think there's, certainly a lot of professional development could happen here. Not sure there's an anchoring phenomena or lesson phenomena here. Poor person stuck again. Last bit, okay, and then I'm gonna round the corner and be done. What's the danger in operating in a vacuum from the perspective of what NGSS instruction is? So here's a separate piece of feedback, all by the same person about the same unit, but I want to just kind of highlight for you how this box checking routine can go off the rails. It's important to have rubrics, it's important to have standards, it's important to have team time, but it's also important to involve the whoever has created what you're looking at in order to understand. It's important that, if you're talking about language like phenomena, that you involve the people looking at that in professional development with the folks that develop that language, and then go on to resources and work with the folks who develop those resources to understand and so on. That's how a good, robust process works. And I apologize to NSTA people that are out there, but the NSTA is not the keeper of the definitions of words and meanings. They were not the creators of the standards. Okay, so I think one of the things that's happening is a lot of folks are going out to get NSTA training for their team, and they go through a couple of days and they do these activities where, they're activities that are very, early, lacking research and efficacy data, but are a good first stab at how to approach the standards in the classroom. And then what happens is folks walk away from that trying to create boxes and then match everything to the box of what they saw and experienced in some workshop. But what's more important is that, can we think about the actual standards and the documentation produced by the creators of those standards themselves, and then approach curriculum and the instructional environment from that angle instead of trying to, line up with something we saw in a training. Because you'll see here, I think this person's an example of that. What is NGSS instruction? Well, this person said students don't implicitly show understanding of claim, evidence, reasoning, arguments to an investigation. Now, that's not a requirement of the standards. Actually, the standards don't even define what the phenomena are. The definitions around what a phenomena is even a bit tricky in the standards. But there's a lot to be said about this comment. So kind of jumping down here, students reading prior to each lesson to be used in a Socratic seminar. Students led to big ideas, which would then lead to other big ideas. I think that word led is, again, a very subjective term. This person sees themselves in the role of being the leader of the thinking, when in fact, the next generation pedagogy around the lessons really have to do with students connecting and engaging in scientific discourse where the big ideas lead to other big ideas by virtue of discussion and thinking critically about them, which is in and of itself an implicit process of reasoning, developing claims and evidence around those, and ultimately coming to questions or problems where we don't have evidence, but yet we have claims and reasoning. So we need to actually spring into an investigation for ourselves into these ideas, okay, into the claims that we're making, gather the necessary evidence, and then reason out. So, the person continues on, while some of the investigations are related to sinkhole phenomena, when the teacher leads the discussion to it, so again, that's that person's understanding of how this happens, the link is unclear. Well, the link is unclear because that becomes the foundation, or maybe it is clear to the students. We don't know. The students haven't done this yet, right? This is subject to how the students engage in this actual activity, but students may be solving the phenomena by the end of lesson 1, they say. So, again, they don't have an understanding of what this NGSS instructional environment and instruction is, so they're confused as to whether they're the ones solving it or doing it or leading it, or the students are. And again, they come back to the fact that they're not even sure that there's anchoring phenomena or lesson phenomena there. So over and over and over again, this person is struggling with the basics, and then off of those basics, they're struggling to interpret what they're seeing. And again, this concept or lack of clarity is coloring what this person and what this team understands next generation instruction to be. So don't operate in a vacuum, okay? Because the type of instruction that they're seeing, the leading and so on and so forth, I think the thing that they realize that they probably shouldn't be doing, they are having a hard time envisioning anything other than that. And so they wouldn't approach even a next generation science lesson in a way other than what they're used to, unless they have an explicit script. Here's the very last bit. So what does NGSS design curriculum instruction look like? So basically you have an anchor phenomena. It may or may not be called phenomena or anchor by an actual word, but what it is it's something real life that students can talk about, think about, connect to. It's where students become dissatisfied about their depth of understanding. Okay, using scientific discourse or Socratic dialogue is a way of raising those problems or questions that students have. And then what happens is students come to problems or questions where they have no evidence to really back it up, as I mentioned earlier, so they need to create plans in order to get an experience and data, okay? How do they do that? They engage in scientific process or engineering design process. They create the process, right? Here's how I'm going to get the data that I need. Here's the data I need. Then they carry it out hands-on. In our case, they do it hands-on. And then as a result, they see a thread of that anchor phenomena, what's complex, come to life in front of them. Okay, they gather data around it, and that's what they use to form an evidence-based conclusion about their hypothesis, about what they thought might be the answer to the question, or the solution to the problem. And so that evidence-based conclusion is an opportunity to reflect back on that anchor phenomena. Okay, so I think about it like this. If we were engineering structures, we could look at a phenomena of a tower falling. Students could break up into teams and have a hypothesis about what would prevent that tower from falling if it was built a different way. Okay, they could actually create a plan around that. They could use the engineering design process. They could create a prototype. They could test it, and so on. And as a result of the data that they gather from testing it, they could come to an evidence-based conclusion about how a tower can be built that withstands certain forces. Okay, so think about this as observing a phenomena, developing a framework of understanding about that phenomena and applying it in a way that's uncertain, gathering data around that, and then using that to come to an evidence-based conclusion about what solves the problem or answers the question. Okay, and this is my final slide. True teaching develops learned students. Okay, true teaching is not about schooling. It's not about developing conformity, uniformity, getting students sorted into the right groups, okay, intervening in those groups to spin them around to face the right way. It's about engaging children in a rich environment where they can become whomever they want to be, or whoever they will be by their own choice. And the thing is that we act as a coach and as a challenging person along the way, as an interested skeptic. And so a student who's learned, and I like that term, learned, is someone who can engage in learning more effectively, someone who can consciously modify beliefs, understandings, and actions in the presence of evidence and experience and reflection. And that's what I just described to you, okay? About the phenomena, okay? The questions, the problems, the processes, the evidence-based conclusions, and reflecting back. So avoid the pitfalls, okay, of things like, environments that are very traditional and that don't require thinking and that are very teacher-directed and focus on direct instruction. And think about the learning environment as being a place where we sprout new ideas, we test them, we judge their value ourselves, we reflect on them. Okay, we modify our understandings, our beliefs, based on the evidence that we gather around the things that we thought. And we use that evidence and those experiences to prune the ideas or the beliefs that are not productive, that are contrary to reality. Okay, and we maintain and strengthen and grow the ones that are useful. Okay, so think of learning as a kind of personal pruning process. So children who can engage in that as a result of instruction have really been taught. Okay, they've been taught well in a scientific context under these new standards, but they've been taught well in general in any disciplinary context. So I will leave you there, and I apologize for having run over. It doesn't look like we have any questions, and unfortunately, I know a number of folks had to jump off. I'll wait 1 second if there are any questions. There is a question pane on your panel if you'd like to click the orange arrow that's there. And a recording of this will be made available to you if you register for the live webinar. Regardless of whether you attended, the link will be sent in a follow-up email within 24 hours. And I hope that you found this useful, you found it helpful or thought-provoking. If you have any questions, you are welcome to reach out to me. Again, my name is Francis Vigent. I'm a founder and CEO here at KnowAtom. We've been here in Salem, Massachusetts for the last 13 years, working with hundreds of thousands of students all over the country, in 5 countries, actually, 6 countries around the world. And we exist to help teams, schools, and districts to develop capacity to switch to the type of teaching that promotes deep and impactful learning, and to develop the skills and content knowledge that these new standards require in 3 dimensions. And the way that we approach it is really by engaging students as scientists and engineers on an everyday basis. And we produce curriculum materials and professional development to make that happen. But really, we are partners in growth and transition. So nonetheless, if you have a need or questions, feel free to reach out to us. If you are in the process of transitioning to the new standards or to new resources designed for the next generation science standards, we hope that you would reach out to us. And it doesn't look like I have any questions today. So I appreciate your time and thank you for joining us. If you do come up with a question later, please feel free to reach out by email. Best regards and good luck in your transition and development of next generation science materials and curriculum. Bye-bye.